Hello, welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin. B2B Revenue Leaders is brought to you by Testimonial Hero. Testimonial Hero creates strategic video testimonials for your sales and marketing people to use throughout the entire buyer's journey to close more deals. Learn more at testimonialhero.com. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jason Smith, who is the co-founder and CEO of Klue. Jason and I discuss the competitive revenue gap and how to close it, the role AI plays in summarizing and collating competitive information, how to arm your reps with the competitive intelligence that they need, and some of the key findings and stats from their recent report where they spoke to 300 plus revenue leaders. This one's a bit longer than usual, but there is a ton of good stuff in it, so I highly recommend it. On to the episode. Hey, Jason, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Dustin.
So this will be a fun one. We're going to talk about a whole whack of things from, the competitive space to AI to probably some anecdotal stories since we're, from the same town and have known each other for a little bit. So I think it's going to be fun. But let's start with, probably an easy one for you, but not for our listeners. What is the competitive revenue gap? Do you want to explain that concept for everyone?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. If you think of any company out there doing sales, they've got a pipeline. There's a certain amount of that pipeline that they're going to win the business on. So let's call that 20%. Let's use real numbers. Let's say there's like a $500 million pipeline. Wouldn't it be lovely, right? So 20% you win. That's $100 million that you might add a new ARR next year. There's 50% that tends to be no decision. There's no progress on that. They're deals that kind of ice, freeze. And then there's like 30% or so of that pipeline that you lose to competitors. Now, these are prospects that they've got budget, so it's not an economic issue. They've actually looked at you. They've looked at alternatives. They just made the call to go with somebody else. So that 30% is what we call the revenue gap, the competitive revenue gap. So pick your number on pipeline. If it's a $500 million pipeline, that's a $150 million competitive revenue gap. And so then it becomes a question of like, how much of that is realistically winnable? There's a bunch of those competitive deals where you didn't have a chance. It was the uncle of your competitor's CEO. So you might not have a chance on those ones, but there's a decent chunk. And so pick your number, maybe 50% of that 150 million is winnable. That's 75 million. That's the number that we talk about as a competitive revenue gap and that we think companies should be focused on, particularly right now in an increasingly competitive environment and highly, highly, highly competitive deal cycles where everybody's fighting for the budget.
Yeah, it's hard to sell out there right now, right? It's a whole different world. Well, depending on the industry you're in. So, you mentioned the competitive revenue gap there. The obvious question here is how to close it. But I think there's a question before that of how do you identify which ones are legitimate and how do you build that as part of your sales process? So, these are the competitors we lost because X, Y, Z, because sometimes that can be hard to do.
Yeah, it really can. And if you look at CRM data, there's a lot of bad information in different CRMs. So yeah, it starts with the CRM though. Like you need to be looking at deals and saying, are the reps putting in who might have been in a deal? And so at time of close won, close lost, no decision, that there is some analysis of these are the competitors that may or may not have been in that deal. Generally, that's the first step, but it's generally not necessarily fully reliable. So often reps will just pull whatever's in the first Acme or ABC code gets a lot. So there's that. What's more interesting is I think as we kind of enter a world where we can ingest more of the unstructured data and recorded calls, Zoom calls, gone calls, you can start to sniff some of the competitive language that might be used. They might use words like tiles instead of cards. And so, you can start to connect some of those dots. We're experimenting with a bunch of pieces there to try and see if we can correct the CRM, so to speak. So those are kind of the CRM and then trying to use technology to kind of sniff what is accurate. And then maybe a third layer is literally just doing win-loss of something that we've done. We acquired a Boston-based company called DoubleCheck that does this. And they, at closed won, closed lost, it triggers a survey leading all the way through to an in-depth interview. And in those interviews, that's when you really discover that there was a competitor in a deal, why they went with that competitor, what exactly happened. So there's a huge, rich layer of information that you can get when you actually do an interview. Surveys, less so, but an interview, you get really, really rich information. And sometimes you can use that to extrapolate what the rest of the population would be. So between CRM, listening to kind of some of the cues in a call and correcting the CRM, and win-loss, you can triangulate pretty well.
Yeah, and I like the call it to not just like a loss analysis, but win-loss, because a lot of companies default to loss analysis, and getting a customer who told you, no, I went with someone else, to reply and actually give value can be tricky, right? So I think going with the 1-1 is important. So, we talked a little bit about how to identify what's maybe going on in your market, what the competitive space is like. I'm curious from like competitive positioning can mean a lot of things. It can be feature set. It can be how they're positioned in the market. It could be their brand. So what maybe are revenue leaders not focusing on enough on the competitive side because it's such a broad bucket?
I mean, at the end of the day, it is about differentiation. It is about understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are relative to a competitor. And, and that's moving earth. That is not something that's stationary, particularly in tech, right? It's constantly changing. You've done sales and marketing for a long time. You've seen it. And particularly now, even in the world of AI, where you can launch a feature and the next week they've either matched that feature or improved upon it.
Yeah.
So when I think about a revenue leader, they very much need to rely on their own team and typically product marketers to look at the market, ingest the differentiation between them and others from, data that lives outside on the web, on the competitor's website in the form of G2 reviews, Gartner reports. There's a whole bunch of data externally. And then there's a whole bunch of rich data that happens just from like the conversations that salespeople have, where actually that new AI feature that your competitor launched isn't as great as what they're claiming on their site. Because now when your salespeople talk to a prospect and that prospect said, yeah, I've played with it and it didn't quite do this well. And maybe it didn't do well for a particular vertical or a particular use case. That information usually finds its way back into a Slack channel of, hey, I just got off a call. It turns out, my competitor XYZ did not do this really well, despite all of that AI hype, FYI. And so, it can live in all of these channels. Our company does competitive enablement. So we try and pick that stuff up and put it into a piece of software that can help kind of collate all the external and internal data. But you can run that kind of thing without a piece of software if you're listening well to what's happening on the external web. And in your internal channels, literally from the Gong calls and from the Slack channels and from the Salesforce notes, you can learn a lot about what's happening, what's truth, what's not. But it needs to funnel down ultimately into playbooks, into decks, into battle cards that help reps first sniff, okay, I think the prospect has been skewed by this particular competitor. And now you have to pull out a playbook where you're not just talking about the value of the category cell that you've got. You're talking about your differentiated value. You do this better and you're amplifying that. You're avoiding areas that might not be as strong. There are landmines that your competitor might lay. Those are all things that you do once you start to figure out that they've been already talking to a competitor. And you can do that by literally directly asking, like the best reps, who are you talking to? Have you done any research already? And often prospects are willing to share, yeah, I'm looking at so-and-so and we've talked to so-and-so, or I've used so-and-so in the past. So once you get that, then you can send your narrative and your pitch down a path.
Yeah. And so I want to dive in a bit to the playbook and arming salespeople, because I think, I've worked with sales reps who have been in an industry for 15 years. They know the ins and outs. They can do that off the top of their head and pivot and move easily. AE, who was, an SDR, who 2 years before that was a college student. That's hard. Like it's a learned art, I think, and sales is difficult. So how do you make those playbooks easily accessible for them so that they know which way to go and can kind of guide the conversation?
Yeah, I think, so there's a question of the right content, that goes into those playbooks. There's a question of where that content's going to live and how it's going to surface. The utopian world of I'm going to surface it perfectly for the rep in the perfect deal is incredibly difficult. So you're going to keep trying to do that, but also you just need to make it within a click, within a search, in a variety of different places, whether that's Slack, whether that's Salesforce, whether that's in a tool like Klue, whether that's in a sales enablement platform like a HighSpot or a Seismic, or a SharePoint, wherever your data is going to live. You need to put it, in my belief, multiple places. This concept of everything lives in one zone, I think, is a fallacy. It's about having the content curated in one zone and then having it live in multiple spots. It's a bit like, there's product that you're going to build and it's going to live in the outlet store, but it's also going to live in tons of retail stores all over the place. Well, that's kind of like all the tools that are available to sellers today. So I think, the right type of content, but it's got to proliferate everywhere. I just want to circle back though to that concept of like the experienced rep versus the inexperienced rep. Before I did Klue, I was at a company called Alida that was in the customer intelligence space. And, we were trying to build a new category. It was largely competing against Qualtrics and surveys and that kind of world. And I distinctly remember having our reps who were some of them were quite educated, talk to a prospect about what we did. And then the prospect would say, well, how do you compare to? And they would give an answer that would be largely winging it. And these highly educated prospects now would tell them, well, that's not quite true. I got a demo from them yesterday. And then you're totally mitigating this trust moment. And that creates, a backpedal for the rest of the deal. So I felt like if you're not equipping reps with some of the knowledge that they need, then, the confidence decay in some of these deals is real. And having the awareness to say, oh, yeah, I know that they just launched this thing, but let me contextualize it for you. Or I know they'll position this way, let me contextualize it to an educated prospect, which, by the way, all prospects are very educated these days. And if they're not in the first meeting, they're going to be in the second meeting. So I think ensuring the reps are informed with the right contextualization of what a competitor is going to say and what you do well relative to them is critical. And so back to the finding it piece is like, you got to put it everywhere. You've got to do it on the initial onboarding, but you got to have maybe a Chrome extension where they can quick search. You got to layer it in Slack so they can backslash and ask something that can give them answer. And then, Dustin, I know we're probably going to talk about AI, but that, there's a real prompt response potential that's going to happen with kind of co-pilots that are going to help salespeople navigate a deal cycle with more and more contextual, personalized information.
Yeah. And I think, AI, I talk about a lot on this podcast kind of because it fits into every space now, but I think it's really interesting here. Before we go that route, I just want to go back to one point you made on, there's a key of having a steady stream of this and keeping it constantly updated. So I've seen this in other jobs where, someone does this giant competitive teardown, and by the time they're done, none of that stuff's true anymore. And it's out of date. And then they bring it up on a call and, it blows up in your face. So I think that's an interesting part where AI can come in, where, especially now that it's browsing the web and keeping up to date, is keeping that steady stream, making sure you're not saying incorrect things. Because I've been on calls where that blew up in our face before, which is not good.
Oh, there's nothing worse, right? When you actually make a claim and you get corrected by somebody that knows more about it. Oh, no, they don't do that. Actually, they do. We just got a demo of it. So like you were speaking what I felt in my previous company. Literally, I had our product management team build this killer wiki that was awesome for 2 weeks. And then, it was a lot to maintain and keep up to date. And so there's this death spiral of salespeople thinking it was awesome to go in the first week. And then second week, a little less up to date. Third week, a little less up to date. Then one person says something that's totally not up to date. And they're like, I can't rely on that anymore. Yeah. But then they don't bother visiting anymore. And then the product marketers or managers are like, well, why should I update it? Because they're not visiting it. And boom, we're back to Slack again. And it's just this. And then the same questions get asked in the compete channel of Slack over and over and over again. So yeah, literally that's why I found a Klue to try and find a way to kind of solve that. And then, bridging into the AI piece, there's huge promise to be able to actually curate that intel and keep it up to date. We do a lot of that now in Klue, but there's still a curator at the end of the day that has to look at a product marketer. Typically it says, okay, you got all this intel about a competitor. First, is it true? Let me validate with the sources. And then next, what do I want to say about it? Again, they come out with some new thing where they bought some new company. There's a fact that you can prove there, but what are you going to say about it? You need to contextualize it. You need to give a narrative to your sales team to make sure that they're effective in articulating, oh yeah, they bought that company and they're a bit of a disaster right now in terms of integration. You could see that a bunch of people have left that company and not sure they're going to be able to capitalize on the roadmap. Here's a quote that we actually got from a prospect that was looking at it. That is much better than, yes, I know they acquired that company. It's super interesting, right? So it's all about the fact itself and then the contextualization, the insight that you can deliver to a salesperson.
Yeah. And you mentioned, pulling out a quote from someone. There's a lot of publicly available data, right? Through G2 reviews. Some companies have 10,000 G2 reviews. And I've been in roles where, we had someone comb through a whole bunch of those and pull out their insights. And the issue I find is for the first 100 reviews, they're great. And then they kind of zone out and just see everything the same and all the insights disappear. So curious how you guys are thinking about, I know you've done a lot of this already, building AI to kind of mine and collate all that data. And yeah, what you kind of see coming up in that space.
I mean, big topic. Let's run this podcast for a couple hours then, right? I'm sure. Yeah. The AI piece, it's certainly impacting every SaaS company. For us, it's fantastic. We've been playing with ML. We've had ML engineering teams for almost now 7 years, but it feels like we've been running through mud, and we have this opportunity now where we've seen these people run on tracks with a fresh pair of Nikes really fast. And those are LLMs. And we're like, okay, how do we take advantage of that and kind of accelerate some of the kind of content generation work, the summarization work, the theme extraction work, all the stuff that is a contextualization layer for curators. And we've launched a bunch of things in the existing product, and we have a bunch more things coming. Actually, in insights and reviews are kind of one key piece of it. Literally, when you start to research the competition, you're trying to figure out where to go to get some of that ammo, and your sales folks will find some things out. But reviews are fantastic. You can see when you dig through the reviews, a whole bunch of little data points that start to provide some insight. Hey, it's really good when they do this, but man, the onboarding experience was a super challenge, and it took 3 months to roll out. So you want to be able to incorporate that into how you sell against a particular competitor, and do it by referencing that source. So it is, as you said, there's probably two things. There's just the magnitude of 1,000 reviews that may get boring after 100, but what we found is there's actually a whole bunch of little nuggets that are really interesting. That's just the human gets bored after 100. The machine doesn't, right? And so when we can keep extracting those insights out and put them in a way that says, we think these are all interesting. And Dustin, if you're the curator inside of Klue, if we can aggregate all of those insights, not just from reviews, but from the Slack channels and from the page changes on a company's website, we can pull it all together and say, this is what we think has happened. Here's a summary of what we think the positives are. Here's a summary of what we think the negatives are across 1,000 reviews. Here are the key themes. Here's a couple key extraction quotes that are really interesting. Then you can take that and massage it in a way that is hyper efficient. So instead of the 10 hours, it's now an hour or less, to be able to do it. And sometimes really out of the box, it can be good enough. So with some of what we're ingesting with all these different sources to create an insight, we're not there yet. I think there's when we think about AI, when we think about trust and the verification of this, like if anybody has used GPT to actually ask it something that you know a lot about, like what are the best hotels in your city? It might not give you the answer that you expect, but it certainly sounds authoritative on it. So there is going to be in enterprises this whole trust layer of, is this the right thing to say? Is this the right way to say it? That will need to be validated by your reps actually trying some of that stuff. And so I think there'll be this trust stamp of Dustin has said this part is really good. This part is extrapolated. We're not sure. It hasn't been Dustin stamped, approved yet. But the first half of this answer that we've given you and this generated text is validated. Do you want to send this off to get validated by Dustin and wait a couple days or a day, or do you want to just go for it? And we know what salespeople will probably do.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was going to say there's always going to be human verification point. I don't know with how fast things are moving. We'll see 5 years from now where it's at. But you find the similar thing in copywriting, actually. ChatGPT, I use it to write kind of crappy drafts that, let me skip that early stage of me writing a crappy draft is kind of the approach I take. So I think that's an interesting angle there. I'm curious too, with your product and AI, like I know we've talked about the sales side a lot and how sales can use it. It also seems like a goldmine for product people as well to mine.
It is.
Yeah, to mine where things are at and figure out what to build next and kind of stay ahead of the curve. So is that an area that, your current customers focus on a lot, or is it more on the sales side currently?
For Klue in particular, I think it's driven around sales. It is about narrowing the competitive revenue gap and helping, salespeople win the deals they should have won. That is, I'd say, the core use case. But certainly product teams are looking at it. And if you think of a product manager, are they interested in knowing what features the competitor is doing well or doing poorly?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Are they interested in what the competitors just launched to be able to see if there's any inspo or something they should not do or differentiate and something they're already working on? Like AI is the best example. Everyone is coming out with more and more AI features. So do you want the Me Too version, or do you want to actually add a spin on it before you launch your piece? So I think for product teams, yeah, there's a gold mine of information that we can pull up for them. They're less likely to put together a card, a battle card, an asset that can be used by 1,000 other people. They're much more likely to mine the data themselves and go, okay, what do I need? Now I'm going to use that as making a decision. So they're probably more on the value of Klue. Klue kind of separates into this like collect and curate the info and the intel about competitors from internal and external sources, and then present and distribute it. And so they probably care less about the present and distribute. They're really into the collection and the curation with the lens of what are they doing so that I don't do the dumb stuff and that I take advantage of the stuff that they are doing that's table stakes that I'm missing. And then what are the gaps that they haven't done that is on our roadmap that could be a big differentiator?
Yeah, I'm just like looking back on all the time this could have saved me. So like when I was at Jostle, part of my role, because we were a small company, was basically product management, and I owned a couple parts of the product, and just doing that research of, okay, we're building these integrations into this space. This company says it has it. I have to go through the trouble of going to a trial, realizing that's a really dumb integration. It doesn't do anything. All it does is like iframe something in. So if I had AI back then, like I could have been infinitely more productive, I think, and probably came up with better product suggestions that were based on actual facts rather than my assumptions and findings.
Well, this is what's kind of exciting about AI. Like, I think, at first, as this started to evolve, I'm like, wow, this is going to put all of us out of business. And there'd be, whether it's Microsoft with their HAL version of it, then it's going to be all knowing. Whoa. And then, you kind of layer it down and you realize there's always going to be kind of a base level of value that these, call it the big LLMs will deliver out of the box from a prompt. And then there's going to be like the supercharged version of that. And so in my world, it's all about the data, so LLMs will do a good job of what's available on the public web. They might not know the history of that. So one thing that Klue does a lot of is we stick little beacons on competitor web pages to understand down to the pixel what changes, whether it's a pricing change or whether it's a macro case study change that they've added to their web page. All of that is trying to just understand what the historical view looked like compared to what the present. LLMs actually don't do a great job of that history of catching that little change. But between LLMs and that's kind of the public web cupboard. And so you're going to get a lot of decent information out of that. But then sites like G2 and Gartner aren't just going to give up all of their data into the LLM. They might get license arrangements, but we're certainly going to license some of the valuable stuff for compete. So there's like public sources and licensed sources. And then there's two other layers. One is the enterprise itself. Like, think of the gold mine of all your other salespeople sharing stuff in Slack. They get off calls. It's all private. It's all yours, but you need to mine that because it just flows through this river of Slack noise. You need to extract the good stuff out of there. Salesforce notes, gone recorded calls. All of these are like input sources from kind of enterprise data. So that's like the third source. And then the fourth source is generated data. It's like, we do win-loss studies, like at the end of it. And whether that, again, is a light survey or a 3-2-1 video, or it is an actual interview, you're generating new insight that you're not getting anywhere else. And so between public, licensed, enterprise sources and generated sources, when you bring all those together, you're going to end up with, in our case, a compete AI that is heads and shoulders above what you would get out of the gate from just an LLM. So that's the value prop that we've seen. And I'm sure many other companies are looking at it from that perspective of what's the level up. You don't want to be the flashlight app that launched on the iPhone in the early days, right? That the LLM slowly just takes over. You want to be the Slack app that is on the home screen of your iPhone and is constantly used, but isn't going to get absorbed by the LLM. So everyone's looking at it from a data standpoint. And then, then there's a whole bunch of other layers that we think about from an enterprise standpoint, the trust, the verification, and the contextualization piece to give people good answers.
Yeah. I mean, as you were describing all the different places to get the data from, I was immediately a little overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data that could be if you're at a large company with large competitors, right? So I think we're finally at the stage with AI where you don't need a team of 20 people to consolidate that and work on that to get to a decent point. Because that was always my struggle. I'd get all this great information and then look at it and be like, now what do I do? Now, how do I make sense of this?
Yeah.
Very much so, yeah.
It's a nice piece of like that curation level. It's always been one of the biggest challenges. Like, you got it all in front of you. All the puzzle pieces are laid out in front of you. And even if the edges of the puzzle are built for you, you still got to do the puzzle. And I think what this does is provide different versions of the puzzle that you can kind of go, oh, maybe that snaps in here, snaps in here. It's a shortcut. It's a great shortcut. But trust is going to be critical in this. Like, again, ask GPT something you know a lot about. Think of the answer that you get. Just like the hotels is the best example. Like, probably in your city what the best hotels are. And if it tells you something, that's not quite aligned with that, now there's like an opinion in a lot of this. So what is your company's opinion of the information that's being presented? Everyone's going to have their lens on it. And so I think ultimately we'll train the systems to be smart enough to do that. But I think there's going to be a human in that loop to not verify it, but contextualize it for a while, just lighter load for them.
Yeah, for sure. Like now, for me, at least how I've been using it is summarization across a whole whack of different things just to save so much time. And, I feel like we could probably go on about AI for like you said, a couple hours on the podcast. I do want to talk though about a report that you put together at Klue recently called When the Pie Shrinks. We talked about this a bit at the start. It is a tough time out there in tech for a lot of companies, and it's a tough time for sellers having to adapt to that. I know you spoke to, I think it was 300, leaders in that space.
Yeah.
Talk about having a lot of info. Maybe can you pull out some key insights from that, and maybe anything that surprised you that you found?
I mean, it was this like fantastically huge, slow moving, painful study that we put together, talking to 300 plus revenue leaders, just trying to understand, what their view is like on the space. And particularly with today's overlay, it's a bit of a hurricane out there in tech. There's a lot of headwinds for people. And so, deals are harder to come by. Pipelines are a little tighter. Everything's a little more competitive. Competitors are getting more aggressive, chasing where the revenue is, which, by the way, is your clients. So they're getting in there and having more aggressive budget conversations and differentiation conversations. I think one of the stats that was most remarkable is like 30% of revenue leaders are very confident that reps can differentiate it. Only 30%, right? So that means 70% aren't. And in a world of a highly competitive deal cycle, if 70% of the market is not confident that their reps can differentiate, I mean, that just felt like a scary moment. It's more crowded. It's more challenging. You got to have, the differentiation. Like when I think of our own company, Klue, and how we think about differentiation, like if we need to be able to pull out things like we do a lot of AI work, we do a lot of ML work instead of a human doing the curation, which a lot of our competitors do. And so they're a little more service oriented than maybe we are on a product side. We think it's an advantage, but some people might not, right? And so how do you articulate that and create that differentiation? Like to your point earlier, you've got to not only come up with that great content, you've got to put it in front of the reps and make sure that they know how to use it and leverage that and kind of do the reinforcement loops. I mean, there's another thing that we noticed on just this huge gap between how revenue leaders look at, the poor performers, maybe the good performers, the better and the best performers. There's big gaps between what each of them can accomplish. And so, that comes down to a personality thing, but it also comes down to like the assets that they've got. And part of that is how do you make sure that there is no disequilibrium of reps not having unequal access to good content or training or grooving of how they say certain things. And to your point, when you start to get pretty good at selling, you kind of get into your zone and into your rut. You don't bother, you turn off the learning moment. But the truth is, like, your competitors are changing every day. Look at your own company. Like, think of the clients that you're winning, the clients that you're losing, people that are coming and going, awards that you're winning, funding you're getting, features you're launching. Think of your own company. Now, all of your competitors are doing that too. And so if you're stuck in your non-learning rut, you're going to get surprised. And when you get surprised, that's going to affect the deals, and that's going to affect the revenue that that company's going to get. So when I hear that 76% of leaders know there's a gap between them, I'm like, well, how do you fix that? Well, first is make sure they all have equal access to the information, and that you're encouraging the adoption of that information. We do a lot of work on cohort comparisons. So there's this moment of like, there are people that will adopt our info and Klue, and there'll be people that won't. So let's just measure what that looks like. So are the folks that are using that information closing deals more than the others? Are they closing them faster? Are they having less discounting at the 11th hour, leading to higher, deal value? And the answer is typically it's one or all three of those, when it's done. And so even if our tool happens to be adopted by 10% of the reps, when they see the outsized gain that those reps are having, then it becomes how do we get the other 90% using it versus that's not a useful tool. And I think those nuances are really important today, where every rep's going to have different capability in terms of their own innate selling skill, but everyone should have equal access to the content that they need to be able to be the best and know what the best looks like. Let's see, one other stat here. Yeah, almost half of the revenue leaders believe that reps don't even know who they're competing against until super late in the cycle. And so if you are just figuring that out late in the cycle, you can't shape the narrative anymore. You're down the path where it's kind of locked into a framework of, I believe this about your competitor, I believe this about you. But if you sniff that early and try and understand it, then everything that you talk about, from how you price, from the features that you do well, from the features that you actually don't do well, and you understand that and you share that, all of those things you can articulate in a way that fits your narrative and fits the buyer problem better in relation to who else they're talking to and who else they're looking at. If your partner is dating multiple people before they're committed to you, you kind of want to know some of that comparison. And that's kind of what happens in deal cycles. And the earlier you know that, the earlier you can accentuate the fact that you're an intellect versus an athlete, and that is something that you think should appeal or does appeal to that person. And you're kind of moving that up the importance ladder for them. So, the fact that revenue leaders know that the reps don't know who the heck is in their deal until late is another impact issue on just narrowing that competitive revenue gap. You got to find out early, and then that's going to shape how you do your entire narrative through the sales cycle.
Yeah, and I think kind of for me at least, the overlapping point or component with a bunch of the things you mentioned there was just closing skill gaps as a rep and being open to learning and growing, because like it's been easy to sell the past few years in a lot of industries, and it's been kind of summertime, and then now it's a lot harder. So you're seeing that gap a bit more, and the reps who are adapting and learning and realizing, this isn't 2021 as we were coming out of the pandemic and things were a lot easier. And I don't know if that's an innate ability, or not ability, but like a trait that people have where they like to learn and they don't. But I have been seeing this separation between really good reps and, reps who aren't doing as well get larger and larger and larger as times get tougher, which is kind of an interesting thing to see.
Oh my gosh, like so true. I mean, it is this, we're in a different selling motion and moment. And for folks that haven't seen a challenging selling environment, this is new and this is challenging. I mean, that's a macro issue. I think what I'm kind of referring to is, if you pick up a textbook from university that's 300 pages thick and 9-point font, that feels overwhelming versus reading a couple tweets or, the summary version of what that is all about. And so I think the format and the form by which you're putting content in front of sellers who are focused on selling, who aren't going to sit there and be academic readers of information, is critical. It's got to be light. It's got to be digestible. It's got to start with the appetizer before you get the main course. lead people into the deeper sections. Don't start with hammer over the head of content. So the way that you organize your content, the way that you present it is part of that equalization layer. It's one thing to have the content. It's another thing to get reps to use it. So you got to put it where they are, but you got to put it in a format that's digestible. We've all moved to kind of micro digestion of content. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the internal systems, knowledge systems, sales enablement haven't. There's still like 30-page decks or docs that are thick and heavy, often not up to date, even worse, but they're just not in the format that salespeople want to digest.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that with, essays on SharePoint sites that haven't been updated in 2 years and just fully mapped out there. So, Jason, we talked on a bunch of topics here: AI, competitive revenue gap, how to enable reps. I know you talk about a lot of this on LinkedIn. I know Klue puts out a lot of great content. So for our listeners, where should they go if they want to learn a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love you to check out my own LinkedIn, which is /OneMoreSmith, ONEMORE Smith. But probably easier just to look up Jason Smith and Klue with a K. And then, the Klue corporate site, we try to actually inject a bit of personality in that. So you'll see some fun coming out of it. It's not, I don't think, your typical kind of Klue corporate kind of follow. So we do most of our content on LinkedIn. Twitter is secondary. So find us on LinkedIn.
Cool. Thanks, Jason. So I'll include those for our listeners in the description. It was good catching up. It's been a few years since we talked. So thanks for joining me here.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, Dustin.
Thanks for joining me on this episode. My key takeaway is how most companies and most sales reps still have a really difficult time articulating their differentiators against competitors. And I think a large part of that is it's really difficult to summarize competitive info in a digestible way and keep it up to date and make it readily available for reps. And even if you do that, you then have to train them on how to use it, how to position things. There's just a lot of work that goes into a successful competitive program. But with advances in AI, with advances in technology, this is becoming easier and more doable. And I think the companies who are able to do this, especially in a highly competitive market, are the ones who are really going to thrive. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, I'll be back next week with a new episode.